There are projects you receive that don't scare you. They don't even feel particularly hard. They just feel off. The deadline is clear, but success isn't. The scope sounds important, yet strangely undefined. There are many stakeholders involved, but when you ask who makes the final call, the answer drifts sideways. You're told this is an opportunity, a chance to prove yourself. And yet when you look for real support, authority, resources, protection, it's quietly absent. At this point, most people turn inward. They assume they're missing something, that they need to try harder. And this is usually where people misunderstand what's actually happening. Not every difficult project is a problem. Some projects are genuinely complex. Some are under-resourced by accident. Some simply require more time than expected. But there is a specific type of project that feels different from the beginning. You're accountable for the outcome, but not empowered to shape it. Key decisions happen around you, not through you. Approval chains are vague. Ownership is implied, not stated. And when something feels unclear, it's rarely because no one thought it through. It's often because clarity would force responsibility into the open. This is where many capable people make a quiet mistake. They assume ambiguity is temporary. They tell themselves it will resolve once the project gains momentum. So they compensate. They fill the gaps. They absorb uncertainty. They make judgment calls without authority, believing that effort will eventually be recognized as leadership. But what's happening here isn't a test of skill. It's a transfer of exposure. Responsibility has been assigned without power, visibility without protection, delivery without control. From the outside, it looks like trust. From the inside, it feels like pressure with no edges. And because nothing overtly hostile is happening, it's easy to misread the situation. No one is yelling. No one is threatening. No one is openly setting you up. The structure does the work quietly. You are positioned as the point where outcomes land, while decisions remain elsewhere. If things go well, the success can be shared. If they don't, accountability has a very clear address. This isn't about bad people or hidden villains. It's about how systems distribute risk when clarity would be inconvenient. And ambiguity only matters when it protects someone. To understand why these projects keep appearing, you have to stop looking at them as work. Instead, look at them as structures. Every project quietly answers two questions, whether anyone says them out loud or not. Who benefits if this works? And who carries the consequences if it doesn't? In healthy systems, those answers tend to overlap. Authority and accountability travel together. Decisions and outcomes share the same address. But in many organizations, especially under pressure, that alignment loosens. The project is framed as strategic. Visibility is high. Expectations are ambitious. Yet decision rights remain dispersed. Resources arrive conditionally. Risk is treated as something to be managed later. What's actually happening is not delegation. It's insulation. By assigning delivery without authority, the system creates a buffer. Success can move upward, reinforcing leadership judgment. Failure moves downward, landing on execution. This is why these projects often feel strangely untouchable when problems surface. Concerns are acknowledged, but not acted on. Escalations circulate, but resolve slowly. Meetings multiply without decisions crystallizing. From the outside, this looks like complexity. From inside the structure, it's protection. No one needs to sabotage the project for this to work. The incentives are already aligned. Leaders maintain plausible deniability. Managers appear supportive without owning outcomes. And the person delivering absorbs uncertainty in real time. Importantly, this is not about intent. Most people operating inside this system don't think of themselves as shifting risk. They are responding to their own incentives, to visibility, to reputation, to not being the one associated with failure. The system doesn't reward clarity when clarity creates exposure. So ambiguity becomes useful. Diffuse ownership becomes normal, and accountability is quietly delayed until after results are known. Once the project concludes, the narrative settles into place. If it succeeds, it confirms strategic direction. If it struggles, execution becomes the explanation. The structure stays intact either way, not because individuals are malicious, but because the system has learned a reliable way to protect itself. And for that protection to hold, it needs one more mechanism: That missing mechanism is ambiguity, not the accidental kind, the functional kind. In most organizations, ambiguity is described in positive terms: flexibility, adaptability, room to maneuver. On the surface, it sounds reasonable. Markets change. Information is incomplete. Decisions need space. But ambiguity has another function that's far more important than flexibility. It allows responsibility to remain unsettled. When roles are loosely defined, decisions can float. When success criteria are broad, outcomes can be interpreted. When ownership is shared, accountability can be redistributed after the fact. This is why projects like this rarely have clean definitions at the start. Clarity would force commitment, and commitment creates exposure. Instead, ambiguity keeps options open. If things go well, the story becomes coherent very quickly. The vision was sound. The direction was right. Leadership made the correct calls. If things don't go well, the story shifts. Execution was rushed. Communication broke down. The environment changed. The same ambiguity supports both narratives. From the inside, this creates a strange experience for the person delivering. You're expected to move decisively, but within undefined boundaries. You're encouraged to take ownership, but without formal authority. You're told to be proactive, yet corrected after decisions are made. This isn't contradictory by accident. It's structurally efficient. Ambiguity absorbs friction. It prevents clear fault lines from forming too early. It allows leadership to stay above the mess while appearing engaged. And because nothing explicit is said, it's difficult to challenge. You can't point to a single moment where responsibility was denied. You can't quote a sentence that proves intent. Everything sounds reasonable in isolation. That's the point. Ambiguity works precisely because it feels normal. It doesn't announce itself as a tactic. It presents as realism. From a distance, it looks like complexity. Up close, it functions as protection. And once you see ambiguity this way, another question becomes unavoidable. Why do these projects so often land on the same kinds of people? Projects like this are rarely given to weak performers. They don't go to people who miss deadlines. They don't go to people who need constant supervision. They don't go to people who push back loudly. They go to people who are reliable. Capable people tend to share a few traits that make them attractive to these structures. They take responsibility seriously. They dislike letting others down. They value being seen as dependable. And because of that, they tend to fill gaps without being asked. When something is unclear, they clarify it themselves. When a decision is missing, they make one in the moment. When resources fall short, they compensate with effort. From the system's perspective, this is efficient. Reliability becomes a form of shock absorption. The more dependable you are, the more uncertainty you can carry without complaint. Over time, this creates a subtle inversion. Competence stops being rewarded with authority. It becomes a reason to assign more exposure. This is why capable people often feel confused when things go wrong. They did everything right. They anticipated issues. They worked harder than required. And yet, when outcomes are reviewed, they're the ones asked to explain. Not because they failed, but because they were closest to the impact. Psychologically, this is reinforced by a familiar internal logic. If I just manage this better, it will stabilize. If I prove myself here, it will be different next time. But the pattern isn't driven by effort. It's driven by position. Responsibility without authority doesn't turn into authority through persistence. It turns into precedent. Once the system learns that you will carry risk quietly, it adjusts around that expectation. And this is why recognition usually arrives too late. Not when the project begins, but when the cost has already been absorbed, which makes the next step critical. Because once you can see the pattern, the question isn't why it happens. It's how early you notice it. Once you understand why these projects land where they do, the next question becomes practical. How do you recognize them early? Not through intuition, not through feelings, but through observable signals. The first sign is accountability without authority. You're responsible for outcomes, but key decisions happen elsewhere. Approvals arrive late, or after direction has already shifted. You're expected to deliver, but not empowered to decide. The second sign is moving scope with fixed deadlines. Requirements evolve. Priorities change. Dependencies appear midstream. Yet timelines remain untouched, as if nothing fundamental has shifted. The third sign is how risk is treated in conversation. When you raise concerns, they're acknowledged politely, then set aside. You're told not to overthink, to stay positive, to be flexible. Risk isn't addressed, it's deferred. The fourth sign appears during escalation. When problems surface, support becomes vague. Responsibility is shared in theory, but absent in practice. No one clearly stands beside the decision when pressure increases. And finally, there's repetition. You've seen this structure before. Different project, different team, same dynamics. None of these signals are dramatic on their own. That's why they're easy to dismiss. But taken together, they form a pattern. And patterns are more reliable than promises. This isn't about being suspicious. It's about being precise. You don't need to assume bad intent to recognize misaligned structure. You just need to notice where responsibility accumulates and where authority doesn't. Once you can see that clearly, the situation changes. Not emotionally, strategically. Because awareness doesn't tell you what to feel, it tells you where you are standing. And from that position, response becomes a matter of placement, not reaction. At this point, many people expect a dramatic pivot, a confrontation, a refusal, a warning to stop letting this happen. That's not how these systems change. The goal here isn't to fight the structure, it's to stop absorbing its weight silently. The first shift is clarification, not as a challenge, but as alignment. You ask simple, neutral questions early. Who owns the final decision? What assumptions are we operating under? What happens if a dependency doesn't materialize? These questions don't disrupt the project. They surface its shape. The second shift is documentation. Not defensive, not legalistic, just visible. Meeting notes, summaries, confirmed scope, recorded trade-offs. When ambiguity is written down, it loses some of its flexibility. Not enough to provoke conflict, enough to define boundaries. The third shift is internal. You stop treating structural gaps as personal shortcomings. You execute within the limits of your authority, not beyond it. You don't compensate endlessly for decisions you didn't make. This isn't disengagement, it's accuracy. You're still responsible for your work. You're just no longer responsible for stabilizing the entire system. Most importantly, you resist the urge to prove resilience through overextension. Because effort does not convert exposure into protection, and silence does not translate into leverage. Positioning does. When you clarify, document, and limit what you absorb, something subtle happens. Risk stops pooling in one place. Visibility increases without confrontation. And that's the distinction that matters. Not between cooperation and resistance, but between participation and self-erasure. Which brings us to the final piece of the picture. What all of this actually means once you step back. Not every difficult project is a trap. Some are genuinely hard. Some fail for reasons no one could predict. And some require effort that only becomes visible in hindsight. But there is a specific category of projects that feel heavy from the start. Not because of the work itself, but because of how responsibility and authority are arranged. These projects aren't designed to collapse. They're designed to distribute risk selectively. Authority stays diffuse. Accountability becomes concentrated. And ambiguity keeps the system flexible enough to adjust the story afterward. Once you see this, the experience changes. You stop asking whether you're good enough. You stop internalizing confusion as incompetence. And you stop trying to stabilize structures that were never meant to rest on you alone. This doesn't require cynicism. It doesn't require distrust. And it doesn't require playing games. It requires position. Knowing where decisions live. Knowing where risk flows. Knowing what you are and are not responsible for carrying. When you understand that, you don't need to outmaneuver anyone. You don't need to expose anything. And you don't need to harden yourself. You simply stop mistaking structural design for personal failure. And from that place, participation becomes deliberate instead of draining. You don't need to play dirty. You just need to understand the game.